The agenda this week debriefed the state of British politics, heard analysis on the coming U.S. midterm elections from writer David Frum, talked family with musician and artist Tom Wilson, and explored where personality comes from. The agenda's Week in Review begins assessing the security of Canada's far north.
I'd like to kick off by, citing something recent testimony to the Commons Defense Committee from General Wayne Eyre. That's our Chief of Defense Staff, who warned that if Russia and China were to cooperate in the Arctic, it would, quote, pose significant threats to Canada's ability to protect its sovereignty. And I want to find out from all of you how big a deal you think that is. General Leslie, start us off if you would.
It's a really big deal, Steve. It's, quite frankly, our Arctic is undefended. We have a few scattering of regular force, a couple of air bases up there, which are only occupied a couple of days of the year. We've got the Canadian Rangers, who are magnificent, but are not actually recruited, trained, or equipped to fight. We have no significant sea or airborne surveillance capabilities, such as big drones or new long-range patrol aircraft. And the Arctic patrol vessels are just getting into service, but they're certainly not capable of operating in a combat environment. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that with the Russian bear rampaging across Europe, though they're getting their buttocks handed to them by the Ukraine, and the Chinese dragon rustling its scales, we should be paying a lot more attention and putting a lot more money into defending our Arctic.
Well, we can do the first over the next half hour. I'm not sure we can do much about the last, but I'm going to ask Janice Stein the same question. How significant do you think this threat is to Canadian sovereignty?
I really agree with both General Eyre and General Leslie that we are a three-ocean country, Steve, but we
don't think about the northern one much.
We don't think enough about the northern one, and it really does matter. If we just think 10 years forward and we assume that the ice will continue to melt more or less at the same pace, the Northwest Passage will be fully open. The shipping time between Asia and Europe will be cut in half. So right now, the largest Arctic research institute in the world is where? Beijing. Beijing. Now that tells you how strategic this part of the world is. And as Andy just put it, it's our waterway, it's our territory, and we don't have adequate capabilities, never mind to engage in combat, but adequate surveillance capabilities.
Just to police our sovereignty.
To police and to know and to see what's going on.
Rob Hubert, what do you say to that?
Well, first of all, it's not a threat to our sovereignty. We have to be very clear because there's often a misuse of term here. But there is a dire, and I would say existential threat to our security. The one thing that hasn't entered into the conversation that even extends further what was said at the House of Commons Committee is no one is talking about the new nuclear reality that we have. We, of course, have Putin talking about the possible use of nuclear weapons. No one has had a close look of the American response, which was enunciated in their strategic policy that came out last week, which basically introduced a concept called integrated deterrence, which really is talking about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, why does this pertain to the Canadian Arctic? Because if we look at the bulk of the Russian forces, they are in the Arctic. Any type of a response, any containment, any fighting of a nuclear war will, by its very nature, be in the Arctic. And Canada should be playing a critical role in all of this, because to maintain ongoing deterrence, to stop the Russians and the Chinese from even thinking about this in the first place, we have to show that we know where they're coming from. And now with the new American policy, we have to show that we're able to actually engage and fight the Russians and Chinese should they take this avenue. And this is something that's not even entering into any dialogue within the Canadian context, let alone dealing with the protection of the sovereignty of the Northwest Passage.
Okay, let me do a follow-up with Adam here. And I'm going to just turn the question a little bit on its ear for you, Adam. The fragility of our Arctic border is something that has been referenced, for decades. This is not a new problem. Do you think Canada's Foreign Affairs establishment has adequately had its attention paid to this problem?
I think that we, generally speaking, in Canada and foreign policy, take our time with these things. Sometimes it's to our benefit. Sometimes these problems go away for whatever reason. Sometimes they don't. When they don't, it's more to our detriment. I think one of the benefits, actually, of slow walking this one is that I'm not sure. I understand the security threat that my colleagues are talking about. I'm much more concerned about an economic threat, and that I don't find Russia and China to be equal partners. I find that Russia is not proving itself to be particularly powerful in that partnership right now, and the Chinese have a much greater interest in economics. And it's the Chinese economic interest in the Arctic. If they can leverage Russia as a weaker partner, that would make me concerned, because Russia has most of the Arctic to itself. If that becomes Chinese Arctic, then there is no way to keep the Chinese from shaping the global governance regime.
Is the job of British Prime Minister now, in a post-Brexit world, simply too tough?
It is a tough job, and I do agree with that analysis in that piece, but I don't think we should feel too sorry for British prime ministers. Look, power is really centralised in this country. It's concentrated around the individual who holds that post. But what they keep doing is trying to pull more and more power towards themselves and break down those pillars of accountability, that some of which we were touching on before. So we've had government clashes with the courts, most notably Boris Johnson trying to shut down Parliament to force Brexit through, and that particular decision was deemed illegal. We also have ministers breaking the ministerial code, which is this code of conduct, often which is a resigning offence. But the ultimate arbiter of the ministerial code is the Prime Minister. So if the Prime Minister deems that they shouldn't resign, then they don't resign. And then you also have independent ethics advisors. We've had 2 resign in 2 years. The post remains empty. And actually, the person who appoints that role is, surprise, surprise, the British Prime Minister. So you can see how accountability is being degraded. If there was very much accountability there in the first place, our system depends on a Prime Minister sort of being decent and agreeing to the checks and balances that are there by convention, rather than anything that's actually written down.
Andrew, that checklist could just as easily describe the Canadian Prime Minister's job. It's the same system of government, after all. When you were in the PMO for Stephen Harper, did you ever have moments where you thought, this job is too big for one person?
Well, no. And I would say that, of course, wouldn't I? But I think, and to add to that, the Canadian Prime Minister is expected to be in the House there's question period 5 days of the week, and Harper typically showed up for 3 of those. And it was a giant time suck. And this shows the importance of delegation and having people you trust. And I think what makes that more difficult in today's environment, Steve, is the 24/7 communications environment we live in now. There is no time to think or breathe. Everything moves at light speed. Everything that happens is put up on the web right away, whether that's an error at Prime Minister's questions. Usually the British public and the Canadian public wouldn't have seen that until the next day's newspaper or that night's broadcast. Now it's there for all to see the second it happens, forcing offices like the Prime Minister's office or Number 10 Downing to respond in real time. And that takes up a lot of time and energy. And, one of the Sunday papers here had this expose of Liz Truss as foreign minister, and the amount of time and attention she had to put into her Instagram account alone. What are you doing, wasting your time with Instagram? You're the foreign minister of one of the UN Security Council permanent member countries. You should have more important things to do. And I think that's just a function of the environment, the communications, information environment we're in now. It's a cesspool, and politicians can't help but meddle and try to steer that cesspool because it dominates their agenda and their time.
Ben, can I get you on this? Is the job too big for one person now?
In the past, prime ministers have often had chancellors of the exchequer, so their finance minister, who are their rivals. And if you have a rival taking on half of the job, so Tony Blair had Gordon Brown, who then, of course, became prime minister, and they both had their own fiefdoms. And so I suppose to some extent that limited the amount Blair had to do. But I want to reiterate Anusha's point that if, as a prime minister, you spend a lot of time trying to get control from existing institutions and not a lot of time spent on trying to get your policy program right, which we're seeing right now with the Home Office being unable to get control over the channel crossings from migrant boats, you end up spending all of this effort trying to accumulate more and more power to do what with? And I think this is the trouble the Conservative Party have got themselves into, is they figured out how to win elections, they figured out how to denounce institutions, but they hadn't figured out how to turn that into a policy program that can last for them.
Ailsa, what would you add to that in terms of whether this job is just too much for one person these days?
Yeah, I think that's a Westminster conceit completely. This notion that the job for our head of government or the head of government in the UK is somehow harder than the job of any other head of government, particularly any other head of government in any other Westminster system, is a bit difficult to take. The truth of it is that any head of government in the UK has, in a global sense, a fairly easy time of it. It's not a divided society, either ethnically or religiously. It's presiding over a time of peace. Democracy is not in peril. Economically, we were relatively prosperous until the government decided to prioritize national sovereignty over market access, as was its right. But I think if there are difficulties, a lot of them are of the government's own making.
The Republican nominee for governor of Wisconsin, who is running this year in a very close race, said just 2 days ago that if he wins, the Republicans will never lose another election in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin is the most gerrymandered state in the American North. That Republicans typically get about 45% of the vote in Wisconsin state legislature elections. They win about 65% of the seats. So that's an outcome that looks like a Hungarian result in Wisconsin, one of the heartlands and laboratories of democracy in the middle part of the century. And those are the kinds of threats that are pervasive. We have just seen an attempted a home invasion at the house of the Speaker, at the home of the Speaker of the House. Her husband was brutally assaulted. The assailant intended, if he could, to kidnap the Speaker of the House. That's the second threat of kidnapping, credible threat, on the Speaker in 2 years. The first was January the 6th. And her Republican opponents treat it like a big joke. And in fact, some of them, including President Trump, our former President Trump, are circulating wild and flagrantly false conspiracy theories that the Pelosi family brought this home invasion on themselves. It was their own fault. They deserve no sympathy. Those are the kinds of things that are warning signs that something is really awry in the state of American democracy.
It is a given that 2 years after somebody new takes over the White House, at least it's almost always a given, that their party is going to suffer in the midterm elections. And I'm just wondering if you are picking up any conditions at all that you think might make this an exception this year.
Yeah, there was a couple of months ago, there were some indications that might be true, especially the mobilization that happened among women because of the abortion decision, the Supreme Court striking down abortion rights, and a lot of state governments and stepping up and filling the vacuum with very restrictive laws. A number of Republican candidates are saying and flipping. The Republicans have always said what they wanted was to return abortion to the states. Now, many of the candidates in 2022 are saying if Republicans win, they will pass a very restrictive national abortion law, taking it away from the states now that the Supreme Court has stepped aside. There was a moment where that looked like it would be a major issue, and I don't want to say it won't be an important issue, but it doesn't look big enough to overcome the top issues in this election, which are the pain of inflation, fears of crime, and loss of control of the border, the immigration influx that is happening in the American Southwest.
I mean, because you can almost always set your watch to the fact that the party in power in the White House is going to lose seats in the ensuing midterm, can you actually point to anything the Democrats might have been able to do to countermand whatever may take place next week?
Might have been able to do in the past. There are two or three things that would have made, I think, a difference. And I, by the way, I'm not just saying this now. I wrote it in March of 21. President Biden made a series of decisions in the very first weeks of his presidency that opened the border to massive border crossings. And I don't think maybe everyone in Canada is paying attention to this, but we were talking about millions of people walking across the border without authorization, showing up at bus stations, getting bus tickets, and being given court dates for hearings 2 years, 3 years, 4 years later. Court hearings they will certainly or almost certainly lose. But in the meantime, they'll be in the United States. And once they lose, they drop out of the legal system and go from being asylum seekers to being truly illegal immigrants. President Biden didn't have to make those choices. He could have maintained Trump-era border policies that would have kept the border secure. The United States labor market became very hot. It's sending out a giant help wanted signal all over the planet. And so people are coming. And if they say, if you tell me I have to be an asylum seeker to get a job in the United States, fine. I'll say I'm an asylum seeker to get a job in the United States. I'll say whatever you want me to say. You write the rules. I'm just trying to get a job. And there's no lack of sympathy to the people who are doing it. But when you have 1 million or 2 million or more people crossing the border without authorization every single year, obviously that's a giant crisis in the making. Obviously voters are going to resent it. Biden should have anticipated it and headed it off. I wrote about it in March of 21 and said it is the single biggest political mistake that he has made or will make, and that looks true to this day.
Madeline, you say in the doc, my dad didn't know that he was missed at home, like when he would go on the road. So we're gonna take a look at another clip.
One time I flew to Costa Rica, disappeared down there. Cocaine was like $25 US a gram. Took LSD, almost died in the Pacific Ocean. I went out there into the water and the LSD had already kicked in. Got turned upside down and started swimming as hard as I could, thinking that I was going to the surface, but I was swimming to the bottom. That's exactly how my life was at that time.
You could have died.
Yeah.
Madeline, as a daughter watching that, what goes through your head?
Well, I think there were a few times you could have died when you were away.
Yeah, I was a bit of a, gymnast out there, I guess. I was a bit of a trickster.
It's shocking. I'm at home playing with my Barbie dolls or, in the backyard, and someone you love so dearly is out there. It's hard to hear now, but I'm grateful he's around.
You've talked about being Mohawk, and in the documentary you talk about being living proof of colonialism, how it erases the person. We also now know more about intergenerational trauma. To what extent has this intergenerational trauma touched your family?
Well, I think it goes on. I don't like to dwell on that too much because I don't want the power of what I have to offer and what the story is to be a sob story. I want it to be something that is enriching and inspiring, and you kind of have to straighten up your back a little bit, and you have to flex yourself a little bit in order to be those things. That doesn't mean that my vulnerability isn't revealed, and that doesn't mean that I didn't put all the truth down. And putting the truth down is so empowering. You have to remember, when I wrote that book, the first book, I'm writing the second book, which is in fact called Blood Memory, which has to do with the things that live inside us, our generational trauma, our generational talents, the things that are passed on to us by our ancestors, that live inside us and that are here for a reason, and that it takes time for us to recognize those things. But I don't intend in stopping telling my story, and I hope that I can at least open the door of possibilities to somebody else to feel the strength to be able to keep going.
I want to ask you the same question, Madeline. We should just say that Sam is decided to leave the set.
He is like Richard Pryor on the Mike Douglas show. He's actually left the set.
He left the set. But as a daughter and as a mother, I wanted to ask you that same question. Is this something that you think about or mindful of?
The intergenerational trauma, absolutely. And I think that it's really important to hear stories like my dad's or people in our lives, because intergenerational trauma is not an abstract concept. It exists in our lives day to day in various ways, whether it's through my dad's story, whether it's residential school survivor stories, but it exists, it lives and breathes in our lives in ways that you touch and you feel and can impact you and can shake up everything you know. And it can also just be this insidious being that exists in your home. And we need to acknowledge those, and we need to see that. I think, you asked about being a daughter and a mother, and it's a really interesting place for me when it comes to my identity, because I am on this path where I am teaching my children what it means to be Mohawk while I learn, but I'm also teaching my dad?
In the short term, on behavior, you would expect those effects, but not really rising to the level of personality change. So, yeah, you can imagine kind of daily ups and downs and that affecting what behavior you show on a day-to-day basis. But people are generally pretty good at recognizing that those are just temporary influences on their behavior that don't really represent changes in their personality. Whereas if you're looking at actual personality trait change, that tends to take months, years, or decades. So happening gradually, it does happen, but it doesn't tend to be sudden.
Okay, let me ask Michelle. I guess this is sort of the most typical question that most people ask, which is, say you got identical twins, and they grow up in the same house, under the same circumstances. They go to the same school, you know, the same this, the same that. Sometimes they even get dressed the same by their parents. Tell us why they wouldn't, at the end of the day, necessarily have the same personality.
Yes, so as I was mentioning earlier, twin research has shown us that around half of the variation in the differences we see in personality in the population is due to genes, but the other half is due to the environment. And it's not actually the shared environment. So most people consider aspects of the shared environment being your socioeconomic class or your family environment. It's the non-shared experiences that twins have that is having more of an effect on their personality.
And what's a non-shared experience?
So a well, this is the big question. There's potentially thousands of non-shared experience twins could have, right? It could be something as simple as having different friends, illnesses, for instance, that one twin has that another doesn't. It's anything, even just chance occurrences that happen that just affect one twin and not the other can set, I guess, that twin on a personality path that's different from their identical twin. And these are factors that we don't really have a good grasp of individually what they might represent, because it's very complex. Even one's parenting environment, although we might consider it to be the same, identical twins can still react differently to the same parenting experience. So it's about perceptions differing as well. So it's quite complex in terms of identifying specific aspects of the environment that influence one's personality.
I guess, Madeline, the $64,000 question here is, how well do we really know ourselves? What do you find on that?
Oh, Steve, that is the golden question. I think that's what a lot of people want to know. We think we know ourselves really well because, you know, personality is these relatively stable patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we have, and who has more access to that information other than ourselves. And researchers show we know ourselves pretty accurately, but it's hard to say how accurately, because if you compare how we see ourselves to how our friends or how our partners see ourselves, the perceptions don't completely line up. And we could just assume that maybe our partner sees us incorrectly, and that's why those perceptions aren't lining up. Or we could think that maybe our partner sees some behavior or actions that we don't internalize as part of our personality.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.